The first, what do we know about inequality? And that's the question I want to spend some time pondering on. And not just inequality, but inequality, poverty, growth. The poverty, growth, employment nexus that really operates and try to draw some lessons from it. And then from there, basically answer some basic questions like why are we doing this report, what kind of inequality we're interested in, and of course inequality between whom. So the stylized facts about inequality, maybe the first thing that I guess everybody knows, and I don't think a lot of what I'm about to show here is probably stuff that you already know, but it's better to put it in this context. First of all, we know that inequality is structural, and in a sense that if you were to make a simple association between past inequality and previous inequality, you will find a very close relationship. In fact, much closer than the one between growth. So, growth tends to vary more than inequality does. It doesn't mean that some countries didn't do some magnificent results, and countries like Nepal, for example, managed to reduce inequality significantly. And here I'm talking about, of course, Manometric inequality, and I'm talking about the Gini index, which is another layer of complexity, because most of what we know about inequality, the conventional narratives, is put in this framework of Manometric inequality, which I'd like to start off with and spend a few slides talking about that. So inequality is structural, worldwide. Coming to the region, we also see that inequality is moderate. If you look at the average Gini for MENA Arab countries, it's almost 0.35, which is the global average in 2013. Most of this data, of course, is taken from POVCAL, the World Bank, so the latest data is around 2013 or 14. And the other thing is that it hasn't changed much over time. In fact, probably, if you want to, pass judgment, it's probably declined slightly over time. So that's the other thing that you find. And in fact, that's in the 2016 World Bank report that was published on poverty in the region. That's the stylized fact that they report, which is that inequality is moderate and declining. However, that's based on household income and expenditure surveys that cover the vast majority of the population, except, of course, the 1%ers. So when somebody like Thomas Piketty Alvadero and his friends come around and they start bringing in the tax data, they start bringing in the national accounts data, comparing that with the household survey data, and then they come up with a different story. In fact, the story they come up with is that the Arab region, and this is based on their latest World Inequality report that just came out, is the most unequal region worldwide when we look at the top, the share for the top decile. So we have a narrative that says that we're low, medium inequality versus a narrative that says that we are the highest when we factor in that 1% of the population. Does this make sense? Again, I know that this is another issue that we can discuss. Stylized fact 4, we are a low poverty region if Manometric poverty, if we follow the $1.9 a day, which is conventionally used in the SDGs and other mainstream literature on income poverty. And as you can see from the graph here, the region is less than 5%. And that's pretty much the story. I mean, even since the 90s, if you go back, we were probably around 6-7%. Now we're less than 3 or 4. But if you were to move up to $7 a day, you'll see that the Arab region is the only region with East Asia that crosses the bar of the global average. I don't know whether, the world total here. That doesn't happen for other regions. So for example, if you're Latin America, you're consistently below the world average. If you're Europe or Central Asia, you're consistently below. South Asia, consistently above Sub-Saharan Africa. What does that mean? It basically means that you have a high vulnerability to poverty. And you can see that in the ratios from moving from the $1 a day to the 3.5 or to the $5 a day. The Arab region is the highest, and the vulnerability is increasing over time. 16 times increase, in fact, in poverty rate when you move from the 1.9 to the 5.5, which, by the way, it happens to be closer to the value of the national poverty lines in many countries. Okay, so that, if I was doing, poverty assessments in the local context, that is the more relevant one. I think the one for Egypt is around 4, and Egypt is considered to be a middle-income country, and so it's around $4 a day. 6. Of course, growth is very important in this context, and the graph that you have here is taken from the Human Development Index database in PPP terms. You can see a stagnant growth in per capita GDP in 2011 PPPs. You can also see something else when you divide Arab countries, this is just for Arab countries, between the levels of human development. You can see that there hasn't been much change in the differences between country groups, between the GCC countries, which are the very high HDI mainly, and the other groups, such as medium HDI, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia is probably with the high HDI with Jordan, and of course the low HDI, which are mainly the LDCs. So that's, I would say, the major stylized facts that I would like to start with on money-metric inequality. But of course, this report, we want to talk about multidimensional inequality. We don't want to talk about money-metric inequality. Only we want to talk about it in the context of health and education and other living conditions. So the starting point would be to look again at the components of the Human Development Index, life expectancy at birth, mean years of schooling, and as opposed to the previous stagnant graph, we see a lot of movement here. We see a lot of progress, and especially in mean years of schooling. In fact, the region doubled from around maybe 4 years on average to around 7 in the span of 25 years, which is quite impressive. And if you were to go back to 1970 as your base year, if you were to go back to the story put forward by the Global Human Development Report of 2010, published just 1 month before the Arab Spring, before the Bouazizi revolution in Tunis, 5 out of the 10 spectacular progress countries in terms of human development were Arab countries, and Tunis was number 3. Of course, that led some people to talk about the Arab human development miracle, because it was mainly based on these figures. It was mainly based on health and education successes from 1970. So there is this tension, as you can see, between the narrative on the economic side and between the narrative on the human development non-economic side. Okay, so stylized fact 8, and this figure took about 3 years of work to produce. And it was done with Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, Sabina Alkir and her colleagues. Essentially, what it's trying to say is trying to move away then from the money-metric story into the multidimensional poverty story, where we have health, education, living conditions. So that if you're familiar with the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, that's basically it. And the acute poverty charts on the left are basically the global, just slightly adjusted, but basically the global multidimensional poverty index results for 3 clusters or 3 groups of Arab countries. Cluster 1 are basically upper middle income countries like Algeria, Jordan, Tunisia, and middle income countries like Egypt. Cluster 2 is Morocco and Iraq. Cluster 3 are the LDCs. Versus another chart, which is the poverty, which is our redefined thresholds and cutoffs and even added indicators that make sense for middle-income countries. So our starting point was that global acute poverty definition probably makes sense for a country like Somalia or Yemen, but it doesn't really make sense for a country like Egypt. So when we redefined the picture, we got the following story. 2/3 of the Arab population are either poor or vulnerable to poverty, as opposed to more than 3/4 of the population being non-poor if you were to use the global measure. Again, you see the difference in narrative. It's just like the 1.9. You go with the 1.9, you have a story. You start redefining the measure depending on how you would think would make more sense for the region, you get to another story. But that's an important issue, and I think this stylized fact is very important for us moving ahead. The other important stylized fact is that despite the progress in education, it's still the main source for multidimensional deprivation. So we still have a lot more to do. And it's in all countries. So deprivation in the dimension of education is still the major source. Of course, living conditions becomes more important for LDCs, but education is still key. Number 10, when we looked at the distribution of multidimensional poverty, we find quite staggering and important inequalities. For example, twice the poverty rate in rural than urban, 8 times the poverty rate in households with heads who are educated versus uneducated or low education, 6 times higher deprivation or poverty in the bottom quintile versus the top quintile, and twice in households which have 8 or more individuals versus ones that have 1 to 4. So these are the basic 10 stylized facts that we know. Of course, there are many others, but those are the ones that I would like to take with me here before I start thinking about this report. And I wanted to also share with you a few other stylized facts in terms of, okay, things that don't really have to do with poverty and inequality per se, but also set the stage for these results, or may explain some of these results. I'm just going to browse through them. Most of the stuff, again, is pretty much known to you. One is, of course, the growth without structural transformation. We have seen a decline or a labor movement, if you will, shares from agriculture, so a declining share from agriculture, employment, but moving to low-value added services in the other service sectors. And that is pretty much, an agreed-upon stylized fact, which results in the following figure, that we have very low productivity, lowest worldwide, negative if you look at the 2011-2017 in terms of growth rates for productivity. Stylized fact 13, as a result of the last 2 stylized facts, you have the lowest return on education. What does that mean? It basically has implications on social mobility. It has implications on our children and their ability to use their effort in order to move up the social and economic ladder. And of course, the political economy governance framework is what is an important factor determining all of this. So what we have, and maybe one way to put it is an implicit don't ask, don't tax kind of social bargain, even though I'm sure many of you would say that it's not been a social bargain because you need to have 2 parties who acquiesce in order for you to have a bargain. So I'm aware of the limitations of using that terminology. But still, in terms of governance, when we look at the GNI per capita versus voice and accountability and look at Arab countries' location on that graph, you'll see that a very self-explanatory picture. And you look at the tax to GDP ratios, you also see a very low tax to GDP, even in the non-oil countries. Maybe Morocco and Tunis are an exception. But for the rest of the Arab countries, we're looking at less than 15%, which just doesn't make sense, of course, unless you buy into this political economy of rent, bigger narrative, which is an important part of our discussion and will have to be, of course. Stylized fact 15, and this is my last one, is that everything I just said is changing, and changing very quickly. So everything that I just said is changing because of conflict and because of the dynamics of the global economy, because of so many, the fourth industrial revolution, you name it. So we have to be very careful about these stylized facts because some of them we simply can't take for granted. Look at Syria. I worked on Syria for quite some time, and in a span of 7 years, Syria, if you would have asked me in 2010, where would Syria be in 2015, I would say, probably somewhere closer to Turkey than we think, especially with the open visa borders, open borders policy they had with Syria at the time. But Syria actually lost 3 decades of development. And so, again, I can go on and on. The situation in the conflicts and their impacts is something that I think we're all familiar with. So basically, to conclude, in a way, we have two narratives that possible narratives, okay, that may come out of these 15 stylized facts. One, which is more of a conventional narrative for some colleagues and perhaps in the World Bank and other places, is that the Arab development model was more or less working, and people are better off than their parents and grandparents. So even if inequality is higher, which, by the way, is not the case, why worry about it? You know, I mean, if you're better off in absolute terms, there's no issue here. In any case, inequality was probably not the root cause of the Arab Spring. What was happening is that there are other issues there at play, you know, governance deficits, crony capitalism, large public sector, state monopolies, education quality. These are the issues you need to focus on, and therefore, what's the solution? Better doing business, less state intervention, and et cetera, et cetera. You know, so inequality of opportunities, therefore, especially, you know, fixing that mix match between education outcomes and labor market, education quality and labor market outcomes, that becomes the key. Versus another narrative that tells you that the Arab development model was fundamentally flawed, or not flawed, but, you know, it had some structural problems, some real problems that you could only detect when you use another measurement apparatus, when you know, step away from your measurement or your lens and you go to another conceptual framework with a different set of measurement tools. And that, according to this one, no, we have some serious challenges. And of course, that political economy of rent and its ramifications on the Dutch disease implications of the labor market, et cetera, et cetera. Again, most of us are familiar with this narrative, but really that's the story, that's what's happening there. And the conclusion is that inequality is a central factor for the future of this region and for explaining the past. But also that it can only be understood in a political economy context. Okay, so without going further, because, you know, I want to, again, leave a lot of time for discussion, why are we doing this report? With this background, with what we know, why are we doing this report? Well, there are three reasons why we would want to do a report on inequality regardless of this context. One is normative. You know, we all assume that inequality is an end goal, is desirable. Of course, some countries like, you know, Nordic countries, they have a higher threshold for what they decide is socially unacceptable inequality versus the US versus here. That's another discussion, but everybody would agree, and I think even the SDG framework, that inequality as an end goal is desirable. Number two, there are strong, and this is very important, there are strong economic policy implications for redistribution and inequality. So that's where I'm coming from, and this is where the pre-analytics play an important role. If you come in from a school that believes, you know, in the work of Kaletsky and Lance Taylor, that you change the distribution and growth will be affected depending on whether the economy is wage-led or if it's profit-led, then of course it's completely different than, you know, one that tells you that you know, inequality is a return to some kind of production function attribution and distribution. And especially in this country where I think redistribution to the middle class in Egypt, for example, may have enormous implications on potential growth. I think this discussion is very important. So economic policy issues are clearly very important. The third reason, of course, is social policy. There's no, I don't need to preach this point, that there's no, you know, talk about social policy without talking about targeting and reaching out to the poorest of the poor, which is essentially about reducing inequalities. Otherwise, the averages, the national averages, won't be able to move as fast as in other situations. But especially in this region, in light of what I discussed previously, there are other reasons why we want to do this report. One is that there is a growing appetite. Everybody now is interested in inequality. Decision makers are asking questions. You know, what can we do? How can we reduce poverty? Students are trying to understand it. Academics are trying to weigh in with their opinions. So there is this debate ongoing, whether we like it or not, about inequality and the role of inequality. But there are still many gaps about what we know about inequality, and especially multidimensional inequality. So there is still a huge amount of work that we can do, and I think there's a contribution, there's room for contribution. And of course, And in an oil-led or rentier political economy, and today we had a discussion about the price of oil, and it doesn't look like that we may be escaping the oil-led political economy anytime soon, the role of the state as a distributor is very important. Therefore, the whole issue about, the distribution versus production is also very important. Example of the importance of inequality is in a case of Egypt, for example, here when we changed the scenarios. So this is a paper that we're doing with Professor Mu'taz Khorshid based on the results of a CGE model for transformation of the Egyptian economy, where you have here two possible scenarios, one with the Gini going down from 0.33 to 0.28 and by 2030 versus one where it increases to around 0.40, and you can see the impact on poverty being hugely significant even with the same growth rate. So that also gives us a flavor of the importance of the issue in Middle Eastern countries, particularly because of what I said earlier about the high rate of vulnerability to poverty. Very quickly, outcome versus opportunities, both are important. That's our pre-analytical position. You can't do one without the other. And Atkinson's beautifully written report in 2015 is a good testament to that. Unidimensional versus multidimensional. We've decided multidimensional. This is the way to go. It's not that we're completely ignoring the money metric, but a lot of work has been done on it, and there's really very little to add. The opportunity we have here is because we have already a lot of data sets that haven't been fully explored, so also that lends validity again to this exercise. We think that there's still a lot that can be said, especially on the trends in inequality of opportunities in multidimensional space. Inequality between whom? Between these variables, rich and poor, spatially educated, non-educated household heads, men and women, of course, large and small households, or, as Russia will now show, between households that have combination of those characteristics. So maybe I took a little bit longer than expected, but I was hoping to cover a lot of this stuff before we get into some of the results. And like I said, we're all looking forward to your feedback on these issues. Thank you.